Olivia Trusty receives Senate confirmation to the FCC. Legislation in Illinois paves the way for electric cooperatives to provide broadband. Reconnect funding restored by the House Appropriations Subcommittee, and a new record for streaming. Those stories and more on This Week in the Broadband Universe. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Craig Corbin. The Federal Communications Commission once again has a quorum. U.S. Senate confirmation this week for Olivia Trusty as an FCC commissioner. This restores FCC Chairman Brendan Carr's 2-1 majority. Commissioner Trusty has an extensive telecommunications policy background and previously served as a Republican aide on the U.S. Senate Commerce and Armed Services Committees. She is widely seen as a strong addition to the FCC. Rural electric cooperatives looking to deploy broadband in Illinois will benefit from legislation awaiting signature by the state's governor. The Electrical Service Broadband Deployment and Access Law was passed by the Illinois General Assembly earlier this month and would allow electric cooperatives to use existing electric easements and road rights-of-way to install infrastructure for projects that are using state or federal funding. The law would provide additional protections for landowners. Co-ops must provide at least 14 days' notice of construction activity to property owners. $90 million will go to restore funding for the Reconnect Loan and Grant Program during fiscal year 2026. Reconnect provides funding for broadband infrastructure in rural areas. House lawmakers on the Appropriations Committee elected to not only continue funding, but doubled the program's fiscal year 2025 budget of $45 million. The bill will need approval from the full House of Representatives. Reconnect provides funding for broadband infrastructure in areas where more than 90% of households lack sufficient access to broadband. SoftBank is working on plans to build a $1 trillion manufacturing complex in Arizona, focused on robotics and artificial intelligence. The company engaged in partnership discussions with Samsung Electronics and TSMC, that's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. SoftBank also seeking U.S. federal and state tax incentives. SoftBank also a participant in Stargate, the 4-year, $500 billion project to build data centers and other AI infrastructure in the U.S. Fiber expansion saw a record jump over the last year. That from a new report by the Fiber Broadband Association. Data based on broadband project information from Cartesian and showed 2024 with growth of up to 13%. That's now 8.5 million homes passed. The FBA report also revealed that median underground deployment costs were 12% higher than the previous year, averaging $18.25 per foot for labor and material costs. Aerial fiber deployment up 1% to $6.55 per foot. The cost increases expected to be slightly smaller than last year. The biggest factor in deployment costs, labor. Another item from the report is taking longer to acquire permits, with some delays forcing switches between aerial versus underground construction. In other news, California may soon join New York with a statewide mandate requiring internet service providers to offer low-cost broadband options. The legislation, Bill AB 353, is scheduled for a first hearing next week. It would force ISPs to have broadband plans costing no more than $15 monthly for residents enrolled in qualifying public assistance programs. The $15 broadband law in New York took effect earlier this year following a decision from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals upholding that state's authority to regulate broadband rates. Similar legislation has also been introduced in Massachusetts and Vermont. Brightspeed has announced an additional $575 million in new funding for fiber expansion. That's on top of the $3.7 billion the Charlotte-based company raised last year. Brightspeed utilizes XGS-PON technology for its footprint, covering 530 communities in 20 states, roughly 1 million homes passed by fiber. Elsewhere, good news and bad news for Starlink, according to the latest data from Ookla's speedtest.net. Median download speeds now virtually double those from Q3 of 2022, consistently reaching 100 megabits per second, but upload speeds for the LEO satellite provider are lower than the FCC's 20 megabits per second minimum requirements. Median upload speeds increased from 7.5 megabits per second to 14.84 megabits per second in Q1 of this year. The report showing that only 17% of Starlink speed test users were able to get broadband speeds consistent with the FCC's minimum requirement. States with the highest percentage of Starlink users reaching 100 over 20, South Dakota at 42.3%, followed by Rhode Island, Wyoming, Maine, and Massachusetts. States with the lowest percentages, Alaska at the bottom with 5.3%, then a quartet of southeastern states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Florida. And finally, an historic TV viewing milestone for streaming usage. Since 2021, streaming is up 71%, and according to Nielsen, streaming represented a 44.8% share of TV viewership this May. That's a new record, but more importantly, that marks the first time ever that streaming surpassed broadcast and cable viewing combined. Over the last 4 years, broadcast is down 21%, cable down nearly 40%. There's a whole lot of streaming going on. Well, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on This Week in the Broadband Universe.